Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. It's a great privilege to speak to you all. I'm coming to speak to you about making education institutions contributors to peace and looking at whether they actually also contribute to conflict. I thought when we came here, the conference would be overshadowed by the ongoing tragedy of war in Ukraine, as well as the conflict in Sudan. But for the past 2 weeks, our news bulletins have been filled with distressing images of victims from both sides in Israel-Palestine, and mounting civilian deaths and warnings of humanitarian catastrophe. The subject of my talk, therefore, could not be more timely, but current events also show that it could not be more challenging either. I'm here to talk about reconstruction after conflict, but what do we mean by reconstruction, or indeed by conflict? Is reconstruction about removing rubble, rebuilding homes, schools, universities, and civilian infrastructure? Conflict can take many forms, and damage to infrastructure is only one of the many impacts. Students drop out, teachers leave, families flee the area, investment in education is shelved. Other impacts are psychosocial trauma affecting individuals, and beyond that, the deep, bitter divisions in society entrenched by war. As Gracia Michel wrote, the destruction of educational infrastructure represents one of the greatest developmental setbacks for countries affected by conflict. It hinders the ability of societies to recover after war. Mostly today, conflicts are between factions within national boundaries, not war across borders. And when the fighting is over and the dead are counted, we can expect the divisions to be deeper than ever, reconciliation a distant dream. Even if we resurrect all the buildings leveled by bombings, rebuild all the walls smashed by rockets, fill every shell hole, smooth over every pockmark from shrapnel, it may only count as putting a sticking plaster on the wounds of history, instead of addressing the causes of the conflict that brought destruction and death. Without real peace, anything you rebuild can be destroyed again, whether immediately, if conflict is still simmering, or later, as conflict resurfaces. Now, although I am editor of University World News, for this talk I'm drawing not just on our articles from journalists and academic experts, but on my many years of research leading the first 3 global studies on education under attack as a consultant for UNESCO and for a coalition of UN and other NGOs later. Education under Attack is now a regular global report on targeted military and political violence against education institutions, students, teachers, academics, and other personnel. It's about bombings, assassinations, forced disappearances, illegal imprisonment, kidnappings, mostly in countries embroiled in conflict or authoritarianism, mostly carried out by state armed forces and non-state armed groups. Sometimes education buildings are attacked because they are perceived as being used as a camp or as an operating base or a place for weapons storage for opposing troops or military forces. An example of this is the Israeli airstrike that we saw only last week, blowing up the buildings of the Islamic University in Gaza, which is a member of a number of international university networks, including the International Association of Universities. And that was a fortnight ago, and it was alleged by the Israeli Defense Force that it was being used for political and military purposes, although no details of that were given. During my research, which on this issue mostly ran up to 2014, I visited conflict zones, talked to leaders of schools and universities where institutions had been bombed, teachers or academics had been shot or blown up, and education trade unionists had faced death threats or imprisonment. Places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Thailand, West Bank, and Gaza. I've also separately reported from conflicts and conflict-affected countries, including Kosovo, Northern Ireland, and Cyprus. For the Education Under Attack reports, we researched the facts about the extent and nature of attacks, but we also gathered information about motives and impact. And we devised recommendations for governments and education stakeholders on how to prevent education institutions, students, and teachers or academics being targeted. These reports were used to galvanize UN agencies and INGOs to put attacks on education as a distinct item on their agenda and to be addressed through their programs. They also influenced the work of the UN Security Council in making attacks on schools a higher priority in its monitoring and reporting and listing of parties involved in grave violations against children in armed conflict. And in follow-up projects, we went out to conflict countries such as Pakistan and Philippines to pilot training guidance on how to protect education from attack. Now, initially, there was a lot of focus on schools, and later, we also developed a strong focus on higher education, with the Scholars at Risk network becoming a key partner. Universities are the key providers of higher education, so are concerned about how and why they are being targeted. But attacks on schools also matter to them, since not only do schools provide their pipeline of potential students, but universities train school teachers and university education researchers help to shape education policy and practice. This is a picture I took in Afghanistan. Shows you a typical example of war damage, damage from targeting. You can see shell holes. What you can't see is hundreds, maybe 1,000 people lined up outside the main gate about to come in. They're using that school, wouldn't pass any health and safety regulation in most countries. You couldn't go on the grass because it hadn't been demined. Such was the thirst to get back into education in Afghanistan, which tells you what the impact of destroying schools meant to them. For schools and universities, I believe there are two key aspects of reconstruction after conflict. One is reconstruction of their own facilities and educational communities. The other is their role in the reconstruction of society around them and the establishment of lasting peace. For both their own safety and as key education stakeholders and as anchor institutions in their community or city, universities have a key role to play in the prevention or avoidance of attacks specifically targeting education, and also resilience in the face of attacks. But they also have an important role to play in providing research, analysis, and moral leadership on conflict throughout wider society. Note that the UN Sustainable Goal 16 is all about the promotion of peace, inclusive societies with justice for all, and accountable, inclusive institutions. People are often not aware of the scale of the problem of targeted attacks on education worldwide. Here are some of the latest Education Under Attack report figures. These are the ones particularly affecting higher education. You can see one of the most dramatic things has been the banning of women going to university in Afghanistan, which has taken out about 35–40% of their students. Here are some examples of some of the worst sets of figures for different countries over the years, and we heard an even worse one yesterday from Ukraine, where 2,638 schools were damaged, 437 schools destroyed, 57 higher education institutions damaged, and 6 destroyed in a year between February 2022 and February 2023. In higher education, the methods of attack include all the physical attacks and threats to life mentioned previously, but they also include curbs on academic freedom and university autonomy. This can mean anything from banning people from attending international conferences and withdrawal of passports, to mass dismissals, unlawful detention without trial, imprisonment, torture, and death sentences, and constant pressures on individuals to self-censor or openly support arguments they do not agree with. A good example is happening in Turkey, where thousands of academics have faced detention, dismissal, or imprisonment after either signing a petition calling for peace talks with Kurdish militants or for being part of a religious social movement branded a terrorist organization by the government. These are methods used by undemocratic, authoritarian, or military governments who want to stymie open debate, clamp down on critical thought, and close down the space for alternative ideas to emerge. Authoritarian governments will frequently enforce a restricted curriculum, banning certain subjects from being taught and banning certain topics from being researched or certain findings from being published. We see these methods used in every situation, in different situations all around the world, from Afghanistan to Hungary to Russia, but also increasingly under right-wing governments in democratic countries. Certain states in the United States, for instance, witnessed the latest draft of measures restricting higher education passed in Florida, including the banning of the funding for university diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. That clearly doesn't fit with SDG 16. In some states, the national presidents has seized control of appointing university presidents, as did Bolsonaro in Brazil and Erdogan in Turkey, instantly raising the pressure on universities to toe the government's line. The impact of threats to higher education was captured in 2006 by the UNESCO Director General Koichiro Matsuura's comments on the attacks on academics in Iraq. He said, "By targeting those who hold the key of Iraq's reconstruction and development, the perpetrators of this violence are jeopardizing the future of Iraq and of democracy." The Education Under Attack research shows that if you want to reduce the impact of attacks and enable education to contribute fully to peace and development, there are two approaches you can take. One is to improve protection and resilience in the face of attacks. Oh, sorry, we've done that. Protection measures can include everything from reinforcing walls, changing roofing materials to less flammable materials, ensuring all rooms have 2 exits to provide escape routes, providing armed guards or military escorts. They can include increasing deterrence in law by strengthening national and international law on attacks on education, or ending military use, which makes institutions a target. Even having military protection, military patrols can make it a more likely target. On negotiating between armed conflicts to parties to conflict to treat education institutions as safe spaces, that's one thing that can happen. You can negotiate with the parties not to treat education institutions as safe zones, so they won't be attacked. And so far, 118 states have signed up to a Safe Schools Declaration, which commits states and other parties to measures to protect schools and universities from attack, including preventing use of education facilities for military purposes. Of course, making that work in war is difficult. Mario Novelli and Viola Salenica, in an essay for Education Under Attack 2014, underlined that a key step to defending higher education is to strengthen university autonomy and academic freedom. Now, resilience measures include changing location, as we heard yesterday, or switching to online provision, removing the institution as a target. So a similar tactic can be used to help threaten students and academics. 2 good examples concerning institutions are 2 initiatives supported by the Open Society University Network, funded by George Soros. As Nathan Greenfield has reported for us, the American University of Afghanistan had 1,000 students enrolled, half of them women, when the Taliban seized power in August 2021. Before government control of Afghanistan evaporated, a relocation to Qatar was negotiated and a virtual university set up. And last autumn, the university AUAF welcomed 100 students in person to Education City, Qatar, but of course most of its students could not get out of Afghanistan. So they are supported by an online dual program with Bard College and AUAF. And in this way, in the words of AUF President Ian Bickford, it's keeping a lifeline open to the outside world for its students. Another example, well publicized, is the example of Smolny College, which was the only liberal arts and science institution in Russia, situated within St. Petersburg University as a result of a partnership with Bard. It inspired many other institutions to adopt teaching and curricular practices that it pioneered in partnership with Bard. Then 2 years ago, Russia's Prosecutor General Office declared Bard an undesirable foreign organization and a threat to the Russian constitutional order and criminalized contact with it. So Smolny now survives as the Smolny Without Borders project, an online project launched by Smolny staff to give an opportunity for students for Smolny College and everyone else disrupted by war in Ukraine to continue their studies, albeit operating on a small scale with a limited number of programs. Now, scholar rescue schemes, such as those of Scholars at Risk and Scholar Rescue Fund in the US and CARA in the UK, play a key role in supporting scholars both via international solidarity campaigns to raise the political cost of continuing the threats, and by helping to facilitate temporary posts to keep threatened scholars working in an academic role but in a safer place. The challenge for schemes like this is how best to provide support without creating a brain drain. We heard a heartfelt appeal yesterday from the Minister of Education and Science in Ukraine on this matter, because the problem is, if you go and study in another country, will you come back? So in these schemes, is there some commitment from scholars to returning to their country and/or incentives to help rebuild it once conditions allow? These are the resilience measures. Now, the meat of the subject, how education can contribute to conflict. We must also think about whether education itself is contributing to conflict and how we can turn that around so education becomes a driver for peace. Many education institutions are attacked because they or the education system represent a form of education provision perceived as imposing either alien culture, religion, language, or values, and or discriminating against a particular ethnic or other minority group. For example, in 2014, we reported the example of the school system in the insurgency in southern Thailand that began in 2004, in which 3 of the 4 provinces were ethnic Malay Muslim in a country that was 90% Thai Buddhist. School teachers and personnel since 2005 had been regularly assassinated, sometimes in front of their students in the class, and a number of schools were being attacked each year, burnt down. The authorities first responded with military measures, posting guards, military patrols, until they realized that that just enabled rebels to hit 2 targets with 1 detonation, schools and teachers, along with enemy soldiers, as they perceived them. It took years for them to accept that the policy of using schools as a tool of assimilation was part of the problem. The schools, they were banning Islamic schools, Muslim attire, Muslim names, the Muslim dialect, teaching of local Muslim history, and they were imposing Buddhist Thai teachers. Eventually, an agreement to hire local Muslim teachers, create a 6th day of school per week to allow for Islamic studies and teaching Malay and the local language, helped reduce the sense of education imposing an alien culture. Mahitol University played a positive role in the process of reaching a compromise by running an action research program designed to help Patani Malay speakers in school retain their identity, but also achieve a Thai national identity. They did this by using Malay in the first 2 years of schooling, followed by Thai. What this example and others we found show is first that if you want to prevent education being attacked, which can also mean if you want it to be available to play a key role in reconstruction, you first need to understand not just the methods, but the motives of the attackers. Second, you can prevent attacks or conflict in different practical ways, including defense and deterrence, but you can only build lasting peace if you address the motives and causes of violence, which usually involves addressing deeply held grievances, such as systemically unequal or unfair treatment. Third, before you try to contribute to build peace or to prevent attacks on education, you should evaluate with an open mind whether and how your own institution might be contributing to conflict yourselves. You might be surprised at what you discover when you do. How can education contribute to peace? Across education in general, there are certain key factors that must be addressed by policymakers and education authorities and institutions to prevent education contributing to conflict. These include unequal access to resources or provision, biases in the curriculum, discrimination in access to higher education, but also in appointment of teachers and academics, and also in the appointment to senior posts. Study places and resources must be allocated fairly and transparently using objective criteria to ensure progress towards good quality, lifelong education for all. This may require extra investment in education for groups neglected in the past. For instance, if their secondary education unfairly lacks investment, they may not be passing university entrance exams to get to tertiary level. But also, education content and methods of teaching and learning must be adapted to promote peace, mutual respect and understanding, human rights, and responsible citizenship. As the series of handbooks on protecting education in countries affected by conflict, published by the Global Education Cluster, which I co-wrote, says, policies, curricula, textbooks, and methods of learning need to be adjusted to achieve these aims. How you approach contested history, flawed versions of which are barriers to understanding, and inflamed desire for conflict, is a major challenge. Part of the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for instance, is the continuing narrative in many Russian texts of the notion that Ukraine is not a real country, does not have a legitimate separate identity. Which language is the medium of instruction, or perhaps of admissions tests, is another issue of contention, potentially disadvantaging whole sections of the population in multi-ethnic countries. In some conflicts, these issues may need to be worked out before or as part of peace agreements. Universities can have an important role in providing the research into understanding conflict and understanding particular conflicts to aid the search for compromises and solutions. International research can help encourage intercultural dialogue and understanding. To echo the words of Sarah Clark Habibi in an article for University World News, but put them in a current context of a protracted war in Ukraine and an explosive situation in Israel-Palestine with so many civilian lives at risk, university leaders can use this moment to reflect on how their institution can contribute proactively to the reduction of inequalities, frustration, radicalization, and violence in society. Perhaps they can begin by considering how they can better tailor the education and training they provide to contribute to individual and societal resilience, conflict transformation, sustainable development, and socially just peace. This may mean, for instance, not confining peace building to a particular discipline or department, but taking a whole institution approach, adopting conflict-sensitive policies, and integrating peace-building values, skills, and competencies across disciplines. It also requires universities to work in partnership with communities to raise awareness, set peace-building agendas, and develop capacities for societal change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brendan. So we do have about 13 minutes or so for some questions from the assembled group. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Not seeing any hands. I have a question to begin with, and I'll go to Brendan on the question which you turned to at the end, which I thought was actually wonderful, that turn to how universities contribute to conflict. A question that's very live for me at the moment, and I know for many people here, is the question of when and whether universities should make statements on these geopolitical questions. I mean, my perception is that you contribute to conflict by doing so, but I'm very interested in your thoughts about that issue.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Yes, okay, sorry. Well, yeah, this is a really interesting question that we've been grappling with on University World News as well. In fact, we have an article this week on how universities should have responded to the Hamas attacks, which focuses a lot on the situation in the US, where Israeli universities complained about the lack of a forthright response, and a number of universities said they didn't feel it was their role to take a position in conflicts. And we've been dealing with how, when you've got information coming from all sides and it's constantly changing because the situation's changing so quickly, how do you make sure the information you've got is right and not out of date? And how do you make sure it's not inflammatory, that what you use is not inflammatory? And how do you make sure you're reporting impartially? So I think for university leaders, well, one thing to bear in mind is that when things happen, in conflicts, they can change very quickly. So it's often unwise to make a bold statement very quickly, because something happens like the explosion at the hospital last week with 471 people killed, we were told. But the narrative immediately came out that it was an Israeli targeted attack on the hospital, and then later information put out by the IDF, detailed dronage footage, which then was analysed by independent experts who verify these sorts of videos, suggested that it could well have been a misfired rocket, not a targeted attack. Now, that doesn't take away from the general picture of massive civilian casualties and the approach you take to rooting out individuals who've carried out attacks in a densely populated area, which is a whole other question. So it's fraught with difficulties, however you talk about it. So I completely understand the university's position where they say, as a matter of academic freedom and as a matter of responsibility, we don't want to inflame the situation by putting out statements quickly where we may not have the right information or that are one-sided, and we want to leave our campus to be a place where people can debate these issues freely, but it's important that opinions from all sides are heard. And it's certainly not the role of a university to close down debate. So I've very much sympathised with the role of university presidents in that situation.
Thanks very much.